Hi, this is Jamil. Before we start the show, I want to ask you for a quick favor. Whether this is your first or second episode, or if you've been with us for a while, we welcome your feedback. It helps us to improve our podcast. Tap the link in the show notes to take our brief listener survey. It just takes 3 to 5 minutes, and your insights will make a real difference to the future of making peace visible. And thank you. By the way, if there's a topic you think we should cover or an idea you'd like to share, let us know in your survey response. We'll work on it. Today's episode with Tehran-based journalist Reza Sayah was originally recorded in June 2022, but his insights on peace, conflict, and the media are just as relevant today. Enjoy.
I say it out loud, and I'm proud. I am a journalist who's biased towards peace. I want to do stories that help achieve peace in my very small and often insignificant way. There are nuances that the American citizen needs to understand before agreeing to spend more money to bomb another country or intervene militarily.
This is Making Peace Visible, a podcast about peace, conflict, and the news media, brought to you by the War Stories, Peace Stories Project. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. The voice you just heard is our guest for this episode, Reza Sayah. Reza is an Iranian-American journalist currently based in Tehran. He's reported on news events from all over the world, including the Ukrainian Revolution of 2004, the Second Iraq War, and the Egyptian Revolution. Reza has spent much of his career working for major broadcast news networks, including ABC, PBS, CNN, and Al Jazeera. In those roles, he's had to explain complex conflicts in the form of very brief segments. He says that unfortunately, the corporate news model often works to perpetuate conflicts. Reza, welcome to Making Peace Visible. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jamil. Great to be here with you.
You've had a remarkably checkered career in the sense that you started in local U.S. TV broadcasting, born in Iran and worked in broadcast journalism many years all over the United States. Now you're back in the Middle East, living in Tehran, reporting from CNN and PBS and other major news organizations. You've covered a lot more conflict than you have peace, but you have that in common with many other journalists, I guess. But tell us a little bit about your background for those of us who aren't familiar.
As you say, Jamil, I've had a checkered past personally and professionally, in that I've had the great fortune of living in very different places and being immersed in different cultures. A friend of mine had a saying that stayed with me. He believed that we all live in a prison of our mind. But the more we travel, the more we immerse ourselves in different cultures, different countries, meet different people, that prison expands just a little bit. I've had the good fortune of expanding my prison due to my life experience of, after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. I was a child. I went from Tehran to Philadelphia, immersed myself as a young child in American culture. And then I started a career in broadcast journalism, in local news in the mid-90s. Getting to experience different parts of America, an opportunity I would have never had if it wasn't for this career. I lived in places like Columbia, Missouri, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, State College, Pennsylvania, Richmond, Virginia, Detroit, Michigan. And then in 2008, CNN hired me to open their bureau in Pakistan during a very tumultuous time. The U.S. had invaded Afghanistan, obviously, a few years earlier. Benazir Bhutto had been assassinated in the fall of 2007. So I got a firsthand look at the turmoil in that region, Obviously, due to the war in Afghanistan, the emergence of the Taliban, Al Qaeda. And then after that, I changed assignments for CNN. I went to Egypt, based in Cairo for a couple of years, experienced the revolution and the coup there. And all the while, after not having been back to Iran for 29 years, CNN sent me on assignments back to the country where I was born. And man, do I feel grateful for having this invaluable perspective from different angles. Not many young Americans, have the opportunity to see. For them to see that what they see on television and broadcast news is very different
Very
from
different.
reality. Yeah.
The metaphor I use for the way Americans see the rest of the world is like looking at the world through a periscope. It's very, very selective what you can see. And it's selected by the major media organizations. I also have been fortunate to have worked all over the world. And I tell young people, young Americans, to go away because they really need to see that the world is not as frightening and not as dangerous as it looks on TV.
Yeah.
And in a way, that leads us to talking about one of the big problems that we're facing in our polarized world. The fact that we're just seeing black and white stories. What we really need to do, I think, is complexify the stories to see more nuance between opponents in a conflict, or just to see more nuance in general.
Absolutely. And I think that the key, Jamil, is for us to understand why this is happening. And there's a very good reason why this is happening, that we're seeing just one narrative. And there is a logic behind it. And that logic, unfortunately, is profit. Much of the television news, broadcast news, is driven by profit. Whether we like it or not, television news is a business. They have to answer to their shareholders. Their priority is not to simply inform people and make people aware citizens. It is first and foremost to make money. And there's been a lot of research done that you attract more viewers if you generate conflict and drama. And I think it's important for people to be critical consumers of news, but there's challenges to that as well. When I visit America, I see the average American is busy. They're working 5-6 days a week, 70, 80 hours a week. They are in debt. They probably have children. They have so many responsibilities. And when they get home and sit before a television or sit before their iPhone, they don't want their mind to work. They want to be spoon-fed something, and for that information to be easily digestible. And that's why people gravitate to news organizations that reinforce and verify what they believe in. And in turn, there is no discussion, there is no debate, because that takes work. It's possible, and I think it's being done. There's news organizations that are doing it. Unfortunately, they don't have the eyes and the ears of the masses.
So how do we change this news model? What would it take to bring stories to the masses that aren't oversimplified, black and white? Stories that show the complexity of the situation.
I think if a change is going to happen, this may sound corny to some people, but it needs to be a spiritual revolution. There has to be reform of what we value in our cultures. It starts with mindfulness. It starts at home with parenting, with changing ourselves. And it's much more daunting to figure out how are you going to change corporate media? How are you going to stop conflict? It's much less daunting and very doable to make the change starting at home.
Yeah, no, that's very true.
Yeah.
But looking at journalists, I mean, it's really hard for them to counteract the dominant narrative that characterizes the approach of most major newspapers and news organizations.
Yeah. And I got a glimpse of why that was difficult. And again, it goes back to it goes back to culture, what's valued in our culture. The first reason is you make more money by creating more drama, by creating more conflict. A producer who's stacking, putting together a 30-minute news show, whether it's local or for CNN, they
Right.
were hired by that news manager because they submitted a very compelling and dramatic newscast that they produced. So their job is to produce equally compelling and dramatic newscasts. And again, oftentimes, drama comes with presenting conflict, not looking at all sides, depicting a good and bad. And if a journalist who's gone who's gone through a spiritual revolution comes in a morning meeting and said, "Well, I'd like to do a story on peace, on two sides that have found common ground," oftentimes they're going to get dismissed.
No, right. And looking at reporting on conflict,
Yeah.
there's often not sufficient recognition that there are governments, politicians, and the media who are not necessarily interested in reconciliation. One obvious example is a lot of people think that Saudi Arabia's fear of Iran is that it's 60% of its women are educated. You know, the Saudis may see that as a threat.
Yeah. In my view, they see an improved relationship between Tehran and Washington as a threat. And clearly, one of the opponents of the Iran nuclear deal, which I think was a very significant achievement when it comes to peace, an unprecedented achievement, obviously was undermined when then US President Donald Trump withdrew in 2018. But the Saudis made it clear that they did not support this nuclear deal, that they had concerns about it. And many believe that their concerns stemmed from the potential of Iran improving its relationship with the West. Many believe that Iran and the US would be much more natural allies in comparison to Saudi Arabia and Iran.
You were in Egypt when Tahrir Square happened. Is that right?
I came soon after
Okay.
Jamil. I mean, Tahrir Square happened in 2011. I think a couple of months later, I came for a month-long stay, and then I moved there and saw the coup, which was another interesting experience, where the Muslim Brotherhood that were elected into office democratically were overthrown by the military, by General Sisi over there. Many observers believed that a compliant military government in Egypt was a much better option than a democratically elected Islamist government. And keep in mind that the Muslim Brotherhood, for a long time, had gone underground in Egypt. They had laid down their weapons after decades. They were trying their best, many believe, to be good citizens. And that's why they were able to participate in those elections. And they won by a very small margin democratically. Bottom line is, they couldn't last for a year. Exactly a year after they were elected, there was the coup. And again, this is a coup that was in many ways funded and supported by Saudi Arabia, because obviously Saudi Arabia is an authoritarian regime. And many observers said, from Saudi's viewpoint, if an Islamist government can get democratically elected in a place like Egypt, perhaps the people of Saudi Arabia would say, why not us? And what would that mean to the monarchy? So they pumped in a lot of money into Egypt. And again, there was a lot of negative reports about the Muslim Brotherhood. Obviously, they haven't had a good history, and it didn't matter that they were democratically elected. This is another instance where those nuanced, multi-layered reports didn't matter. There was a movement to get them out, and nobody could stop it.
Yeah, I mean that's what becomes the dominant narrative
Yeah.
when the reactionary forces kind of work
Yeah.
against the
And
implementation of democracy.
And the movements, the momentum against one side is so strong that, imagine someone saying, well, the Muslim Brotherhood have a point. You'll get buried. You'll get buried. Same thing happening, in my view, in Ukraine right now, in Russia. There are no competing voices. There's one narrative. There's one narrative that it's Russia's fault. Putin is evil. All of those may be true, but as you say, it's not black and white. Anyone who understands the history of Ukraine, the conflict between Russia and the West, this tug of war that has gone for generations, the expansion of NATO, understands that there's reasonable arguments on both sides. And if you care about the people of Ukraine, you get all these voices together and you have an honest discussion. You don't dehumanize the other side. And where have you seen that recently in corporate media? You simply don't see it. No one even has the opportunity to say, well, maybe we need to listen to the other side. It's just not happening.
Yeah. I mean, what's missing from the whole thing is dialogue.
Yeah.
I think Zelensky certainly made an attempt to initiate a dialogue where he tried to go over the head of the dictator, the Russian dictator, and try to talk to the people of Russia directly and make it crystal clear that he wasn't against them. They were simply trying to save their own country and their own democracy and their autonomy.
Yeah, Jamil, I think, by then it was too late. If you look back at his campaign, he made a promise of better relations with Russia. And the vote indicated that that's what the people of Ukraine, whether in Eastern Ukraine, where there's so many marital and ethnic ties to Russia, or Western Ukraine, everybody wanted peace with Russia, stability with Russia. He ran on that and he got voted in. But before the war, unfortunately, there was never a meeting between these two heads of state. And now we see the outcome. And, who knows where it's going to lead, but it's a very dangerous situation where you have two nuclear powers going head to head.
I want to get back to the revolution in Egypt for a minute. Early on, the coverage was very celebratory. Here was a people's revolution bringing democracy to the Middle East. But over time, the tone of the coverage shifted dramatically, and so did U.S. foreign policy towards Egypt. What do you think was missing from the media narrative? What did they get wrong?
I think it's important to point out that one of the weaknesses of news these days is that it's a medium that does not allow in-depth reporting. Whenever I went on an assignment, Jamil, most often, 90% of the time, I had 2.5 minutes to do a report.
Right.
How are you going to inject nuance and complexity, in a 2.5 minute report? Yeah. 2.5 minutes is only enough time to say, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, this is what needs to be done. Back to you in the studio. The medium is very limited. That's not the whole story. And hopefully that report will generate some interest for people to go read up on it more in depth. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen often. When you look at Egypt, obviously, when the uprising happened, the news media, the U.S. news media, international news media, they mobilized. And you could see, the power with which they mobilized. They got into Egypt. They were covering all angles. It was a simple story to understand. Here was the dictator general, and here was the people rising up to overthrow them for democracy. The U.S. waffled for a little while, but then they put their support behind the people. So it was a very digestible story that had a happy ending. Here comes democracy in Egypt. After a very long time, we're going to have elections. When things turned was when the wrong people got elected.
Right.
The Muslim Brotherhood got elected, and that wasn't to the liking to a lot of centers of power. That's when I think the coverage hurt a little bit. I noticed that the tide was turning, and like I said, in 1 year, this democratically elected government that won by a very small margin was ousted, and back came another military dictator that started winning elections like Mubarak did by getting 98% of the votes. In that 1 year where I was there in 2012, it was remarkable to see the debate, the intense debates, the freedom to talk, the television shows that emerged, both sides criticizing one another, the comedy that emerged.
Yeah, that's true.
Criticizing the Muslim. There was freedom. There was freedom to talk, freedom to express yourself, political freedom. However, it was messy. It was ugly. It was hard to cover because there were so many voices. But someone said, a new democracy is like a newborn baby. You got to take care of it. It's not going to be pretty all the time, but it's delicate. You have to understand that when this little baby makes a mess of itself, you have to understand. You have to give it time. That didn't happen because the government that was elected was not to the liking of a lot of people.
One thing that you mentioned, and I think this grew out of your experience working on TV news in the United States, is, that you talked about the fact that major news organizations often hire people straight out of college. And they don't have the maturity necessarily to see nuances in the story they're covering. And that's an interesting problem because one of the things you do see as you get older is nuance.
Wisdom. And
wisdom.
Do you remember when you were 20, 21? How much wisdom did you? I didn't have much wisdom. I mean,
Nope.
I had good intentions,
Mm-hmm.
but how well did you understand people, personalities, personality disorders, politics, motivations? There's a lot of times you have accountants heading newsrooms because, they're the ones who are good at getting the bottom line to the liking of the shareholders. And it saves you money to get a good-looking, presentable kid out of college instead of hiring a seasoned journalist who's worked 20 years. And because of that experience, obviously demands a little bit more money. I worked in Detroit for the ABC affiliate, WXYZ. I worked with one of the best investigative journalists that I've ever worked with. He was the best, Steve Wilson. And he was doing long format reports that took 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks to produce. Okay. So he wasn't on air every day, but he produced reports that toppled the mayor of Detroit, Kwame Kilpatrick, that brought down people in power in local government. In other words, they were effective reports that were watchdog journalism. Long story short, Steve Wilson's contract was not renewed. It said, bye-bye, we don't value that. You're too expensive. We'll bring in these college kids who don't protest when you say turn a report every day. They're like, okay, I'll do whatever you say. So investigative journalism is out. Watchdog journalism is out. Corrupt politicians get to do whatever they want.
And they're no longer held accountable.
They're no longer held accountable. And the young reporters get the job that they want, the status that they want. They're on TV, and that's that.
And the system continues.
In a democracy, I mean, we learned this. We learned this as kids in middle school. Journalists are the watchdogs of the government. Instead of being watchdogs these days, they're literally doing play-by-play. I mean, go watch the news. I tell people, go watch the news, get a pen and a paper, and write down what you learned today. What information did you learn? All it is play-by-play. They pretty much have the same role as announcers at a football game. He said this, he said this, he said this, he answered back. He scored 1 point, he scored 2 points.
Now, more recently, you've done several reports from Iran for the PBS NewsHour. PBS is a nonprofit public broadcasting organization. Does that change the equation for you?
Well, PBS allows me to do the longest reports. They let you go 10 minutes. But even that 10 minutes is not enough. Even that 10 minutes is not enough if you want to present a counter narrative. I tried to do that with a series that we did on Iran's presence in Iraq a couple of years ago.
I saw some of those pieces. They're good.
That was an instance where you had a news organization like PBS was very supportive in giving me the time necessary to do an in-depth report. We did a 3-part series, and the narrative at that point when Mr. Trump was president that Iran is a growing danger. There was talk of military intervention. And I'm biased towards peace. I say it out loud and I'm proud. I am a journalist who's biased towards peace. I want to do stories that help achieve peace in my very small and often insignificant way. So I noticed this narrative that was very black and white coming from the Western media that Iran is a growing danger and they are dominating Iraq. There are nuances that the American citizen needs to understand about Iran's relationship with Iraq before agreeing to spend more money to bomb another country or intervene militarily. So what I did, the first part of our series, we showed in that report that certainly and naturally Iran has a lot of historic ties, economic ties to Iraq because they're neighbors, religious ties because there's 25 million Shias in Iraq. However, I also introduced in that report to the American viewer Ayatollah Sistani, who is the leader of Iraqi Shias. This is an Iraqi religious leader who does not even recognize Iran's leadership as legitimate, who believes that religion should be separated from government, something that obviously Iran doesn't believe in. So here's a leader of 25 million Shias that doesn't even recognize Iran's legitimacy, the government's, and therefore his 25 million followers don't recognize the legitimacy of Iran's government either. So this is an example of saying, no, Iran has a presence in Iraq, but they're not dominant. All Iraqi people don't bow down to Iran. There's a lot of significant differences. That was an angle that was missing in the media coverage of Iran's and Iraq's relationship. The next report that we did, which was another 10-minute report about how tacitly Iran and the U.S. worked together to defeat ISIS, a Sunni militant organization. Not a lot of people in America know that Iran and ISIS were enemies, that ISIS, a Sunni militant group, was a very big threat to Iran's Shia government and Shia majority. And tacitly, Iran worked to defeat ISIS militants on the ground, and the U.S. using air power did their part. So it was an example of these two countries in a 40-year conflict working together to get rid of the global enemy number one, ISIS. And how often did you hear that narrative in US media? So the bottom line with PBS NewsHour was I'm grateful that they were interested in these narratives. I'm grateful that they gave me more than 2 minutes to do these stories. But when you look at the landscape, I understood that these 10 minutes would be buried under the avalanche that came
Right.
with the other narrative. If you want to convey something, you have to do it every day, repeatedly. And it's very likely that those reports that I did about Iran's and Iraq's relationship, people who were against that narrative probably described me as a sympathizer to the Iranian government. And the other group already knew what I was telling them. So that was another depiction of how limited this medium is, unfortunately.
You just mentioned something that really captures my attention just because of the War Stories, Peace Stories project and who we are and what we're all about. You said you're a journalist who is an advocate for peace. And that's so refreshing to hear. You get many opportunities to, in a sense, implement that in your work.
First of all, I want to know who's not an advocate for peace. What journalist? I want to talk to the journalist who's not an advocate for peace. But and I think subconsciously, a lot of journalists and unintentionally, subconsciously do work that go against peace. And I think I was part of that too. I remember when I was, a journalist when 9/11 happened, and shortly thereafter there was the attack on Iraq, and how many journalists stood up to question that foreign policy decision. I certainly didn't. I just wanted to be, I wanted to be a good journalist. I thought I was doing my job, but I really wasn't. I didn't have the courage to stand up and question authority. And many journalists didn't. Again, as I grew older and I understood
you
how
in the
these
New York Times. I mean,
right. And you know what? It was because I was younger. It was because I valued my job. I didn't want to get fired. I wanted to get my paycheck. And I think that comes with, growing. It comes with experience. It comes with becoming a seasoned journalist. It comes with experiences like going to Pakistan and seeing, my reports about suicide bombings are impacting these innocent people who simply want peace. So I have to rethink my approach to my job and maybe put my job status in jeopardy by speaking up. But it's okay because at night I can sleep a little better and I become a more authentic person. To answer your question, I reflect a little more. I try to have the courage to speak up and push for different angles. These examples that I gave you, that we had the good fortune of working with PBS NewsHour to produce. Another report we did for them was on the Jewish community here in Iran. I mean, it's angles like this,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could easily, any journalist, any seasoned journalist can depict a country the way they want to. I can go out here because of my experience and with my camera and my writing, scare people about Iran, okay? Which happens often,
Right.
Or I can work a little harder. I can convince that producer who doesn't even have time for me on the phone to say, listen, I have something to tell you. I think this is a really interesting story. I think this is an important story. And I can hopefully persuade that producer to allow 10 minutes to show the American viewer about this Jewish community in Iran.
Reza, as I knew this was going to happen, but we could talk for a long time.
Yes, we can.
It's been fascinating. The variety of perspectives that you bring to this these issues is really, really valuable. And I'm very glad you were able to spend a few minutes with us today.
Jamil, I want to thank you for this invite. I love what you're doing, and whatever I can do to help with your efforts, let me know. And it was a pleasure to be on your show. And like you said, we can talk for another couple of hours, and hopefully we'll have another opportunity
Well,
soon.
as they say in the Middle East, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay.
We have links to some of Reza's reports for the PBS NewsHour in the notes for this episode. Making Peace Visible is produced by Andrea Muraskin. I'm Jamil Simon. Peter Agus is the creative director of the War Stories Peace Stories project. We're on Twitter at War Stories Peace. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend or a colleague. We're a new podcast, and your help spreading the word goes a long way.